Hey everyone, Matt Brunig here. My last video, I got this comment from Yuri Strauss. It asks, would love an episode about how the Nordics financed the welfare states. I remember the conservative message in the 90s being, sure, Sweden is great, but it's going broke. I'd like to encourage people to leave comments like this. It gives me good ideas. I've been working on this stuff for a long time, so I start to lose track of what is established, what isn't established, what people need to know, things like that. So, yeah, leave those comments and I'll jump in and give you some answers. So, let's just start with some of these graphs. This is just from the OECD, give you a general sense of what we're talking about here. So we have here general government spending as a percent of GDP. I've picked the year 2019 because that's the year right before COVID, so that gets you a good, sense of a normal year. I think you can see the labels here, but the United States here is in the orange. We spend 38.5% of GDP with government spending. For Sweden, it's 49%. For Denmark, it's 49.7. For Norway, it's 51.6. And for Finland, 53.3. So the Nordics are tightly oriented around 50% of GDP, while we're about 12 percentage points lower. And general government spending is all levels of government. So we're including both federal, state, and municipal spending. Now, the word spending, this is based on the national accounting guidelines that they set out. Spending can sometimes be difficult to define. Is a tax cut spending? Is a tax a reduction in spending? There are lots of ways to play with this, but this is based on one particular accounting standard that they apply across all of these five. And, you get a pretty intuitive account here. They spend, about 25% more than we do, a little bit more, maybe 28, 29% more than we do. And so, they must be going broke, whatever that might mean. But on the flip side, we have here general government revenue. Unfortunately, the bar colors do not stay the same across these two, but the order stays the same, I believe. No, even that doesn't stay the same. Well, anyways, as you can see, general government revenue, the US has the least, 31.8, and their general government revenue for these three Nordic countries is tight around 50%, a little bit more for Finland, a little bit more for Denmark, a little bit less for Sweden. At Norway, you got 58%. So if you take all the government revenue, you divide it by GDP, it's 58%. And that's because they capture all of the revenue from oil exploration off the coast and they bring that into general government, but they don't spend it, right? So you notice their spending is right in line with the others. In fact, Finland spends a little bit more than Norway does as a percent of GDP, but Norway has more revenue, quite a bit more revenue than the other three, and that's because of the oil. They take that revenue, they invest it, they build up a big capital fund. So, as far as going broke is concerned, the main, one main indicator people will look at is just government deficit, right? So this is just the prior two charts, but you're finding the difference between them. So in the US in 2019, our government deficit was 6.7% of GDP. Finland was a little less than 1% of GDP. With growth, that's roughly zero. And then Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And as I said before, Norway runs a big government surplus. So these are surpluses. So three of the four are in government surplus. Finland is basically break even. It's only the United States that has a big deficit. And this is typical. This is not I've got the 2019, but we can spread it out a little bit more. You can look at it over time. Here you see the red line is the US. The red line's always, even back to the 70s, it's always trailing these other groups. You have a few exceptions, like right here, Finland had a huge recession in the early 90s, and that actually brought its deficit down below the US's briefly. A little bit here in Sweden also had that recession. But other than that, government deficits in these countries are smaller than they are here. And in fact, in a lot of years, they're running surpluses. But if, revenue in, spending out in a given year is not your bag, we can also look at government debt, which is, of course, just the accumulation of government debts and deficits and surpluses. And this is just government debt. I'm going to use what I think are some better indicators here later. But people talk a lot about debt, so why not go into it? So if we take general government debt as a percent of GDP, we're still in 2019. Norway's government debt's about half of GDP, Denmark half of GDP, Sweden a little over half of GDP. Finland's quite a bit higher. Finland's had troubles lately. They had a double dip recession in the mid-2000s that they've been struggling to come out of. They're right by Russia there, so chaos in Russia often means chaos in Finland. But yeah, they have the highest level of debt among the four. But then here's the U.S. at 136% of GDP in debt. So as far as, quote unquote, going broke, as people talk about that colloquially, it's the U.S. that is in the worst position. Our government fiscal position is worse, by far worse, than the other four. But debt's not the full picture. We focus a lot on debt, but it's important to remember that governments also have assets. If you're thinking about other entities, we don't usually focus just on how much debt they have. We also look at the other side of their balance sheet and say, how many assets do you have, right? If I take out, $100 million of debt and then buy a $100 million asset, my net financial position is unchanged, right? So we should try to net these things out a little bit. And one way to do this that you get with the OECD is they do general government financial wealth. So this is just government assets minus government debt, but it's only financial assets. So they're only counting things like government ownership of stocks, government ownership of bonds, government ownership of other people's debts, things like that. That's the only thing they're counting. They're not counting other kinds of assets. I'll get into that later. And one reason why you might pick financial wealth is that financial wealth is very fungible, right? If the government owns a bunch of stocks and bonds and it has a bunch of debt, if for some reason it wanted to pay off its debt, it could just sell the stocks and bonds pretty quickly and then pay off the debt, right? For other kinds of wealth that's like tied up in real estate or other assets that aren't so easy to sell, it might be a little bit of a different story. But here's financial wealth. When we do this, the story gets even better, I guess. The U.S., the government financial wealth is negative 110% of GDP. So it's a little bit better than the 136 here, right? So the government does have some financial assets, and so that brings it to 110 instead. But notice, all four of the Nordics have a positive government financial net worth. So their government has more assets than it has liabilities. Going broke? I wouldn't say so. Now, we've got a few other measures we can use here. I'll give you two more that roughly are trying to do the same thing. So back in a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the IMF put this out, the International Monetary Fund, and I was very intrigued by it when they put it out. Actually, I should probably go to full screen here, right? There we go. They did this thing called a public sector balance sheet, and they included lots of things. So they're trying to get the full net worth of a government, and they're including the central bank's assets, because sometimes we don't include central bank assets in this. We only include assets held by the Treasury. They include financial assets, financial liabilities, non-financial assets. So they try to really get the full picture sheet. Like if you were creating a balance sheet for the government the same way you would create one for a business or a household, and you really put everything into it, what would the net worth be there? Now, unfortunately, this website doesn't show the data very well, and they haven't updated it since 2016. I imagine it's quite an undertaking to produce this stuff, but they did it once, and of course, I always remember and I always keep track. So this is this data. I've represented it in this graph here. Here's total net worth of the government as a percent of GDP. Now, as you can see, Norway has 350% of GDP in government net worth. That's because the government owns huge amounts of assets, especially in stocks and bonds. The other governments, here we got Finland. Their government net worth is equal to 111% of GDP. For Sweden, it's 98% of GDP. For Denmark, it's 43% of GDP. For the US, if you bring in all the stuff, so including all the federal land that's owned by the government, which is huge, right? We have a big ownership of public land in the US. You bring all those assets in, the net worth is still negative. It's still a little tiny little negative 6%. About even, but still negative and clearly trailing the other four. Here's a similar measure from the World Inequality Database. They use slightly different methods, have slightly different data sources. I think the IMF one is probably better. But this is a fun one as well. You see the same kind of trend here. And then I've got here the financial net worth, which is, we saw that earlier, but I put it in this graph as well for 2017. So yeah, I mean, under any measure that you could think about, these countries do not go broke, right? They usually run surpluses. They have much lower government debt, and they are they have a positive financial position, meaning the government has more assets than it has liabilities. So if you wanted to look at a country where none of that's true, where you have frequent high deficits, low government assets, high government debt, that's the U.S. What else do we have here? Oh, yeah. So what might people think about, be talking about when they think about specifically a welfare state causing a country to go broke or whatever? Usually they're talking about government deficits and debts and financial liabilities and that kind of thing. But another thing they might be saying, which is a little bit more reasonable, though a little bit confused, is related to especially like an aging population that we have these days, right? So I would say this is where a lot of the discourse is these days, probably not in the 90s, but these days, right? So let's remember this graph that I had in a video I did a while ago. We have the population composition at every age between 0 and 80, and the blue here is workers. So these people are producing all of the income in the country. Oh, well, no, actually there's natural resources. What about capital? Let's put that aside for the moment. Like, for practical purposes, these folks, they go out and work each day. They produce the income. And I don't even necessarily mean monetary income, like money. Obviously, they don't produce money. It's a sort of token or whatever. But they produce the stuff. They provide the services. They provide the goods. These folks don't produce, not in the moment, right? Or at least they don't produce in the market. Obviously, many of these people do things outside of the market, especially caregivers who do a lot of very important work. It's just not a market wage. But especially these folks, the kids, they're not really producing anything, but they are consuming. And elderly and retired's the same way. They're not really producing anything, but they are consuming. So, you know, the big game of the welfare state, though I would also say society generally, whether you have a welfare state or not, the big challenge, or one of the big challenges, is making sure that you're producing enough with these guys in blue in order to cover all these guys, the non-blue. Right? You got to spread the money out. It's got to get over here. And a welfare state does that beautifully. But even if you didn't have a welfare state, you got to find some way to take their productivity and spread it across the whole population. Now, when you look at this particular graph, you say, that's not that challenging. I mean, you know, there's a lot of blue. And, you know, if you just kind of take, I don't know, 25, 30% of what they produce and shoot it out to these guys, you're probably good, right? The problem occurs when the blue starts to shrink, right? And I guess one critique you could make of the welfare state, though it's factually inaccurate, is that, well, when you have these great government benefits, people don't want to work and they just don't work, right? And so the blue shrinks and you just have a bunch of unemployed people, or a bunch of people who are on paid leave all the time and all that kind of stuff. And while it's true, certainly that, in these countries they have chosen to do less work, like have more vacation and less work, it's also true that they have more people employed in the prime ages, which is 25 to 55. They have more workers employed in the prime ages than the U.S. has, right? So you don't really have the issue of able-bodied working age people are just dropping out of the workforce because the welfare state is so generous they don't want to work. You don't really have that problem. But you have a different problem, and this is a problem that's facing kind of the West generally, not just these welfare states, though these welfare states are facing it a little bit earlier than the U.S., and we've seen this most prominently in Japan, which is the population is starting to age, right? So a larger percentage of the population is in this gray here, right? And so now if the blue is shrinking, and it wouldn't shrink in this graph because this graph just uses ages, but if the blue across the whole society and raw number starts to shrink and the gray starts to grow, now you got to stretch less income across more people, and that can create at minimum political challenges, though the countries in the West are so high income that it's hard to imagine that it would present just absolute scarcity problems. It's more just a challenge of how do we get people to swallow the fact that, yeah, when a larger percentage of your population is retired than used to be, you're going to have to take a slightly smaller share. Your paycheck's going to have to be slightly smaller so that you can kick some money out to elderly folks. And so what am I talking about concretely here? Let's look at this from Sweden. This is a graph of the population by age group. So we get what percentage of the population is in each age group. And you see it's broken down by year here. And so here we got the elderly, 65 plus. Here we got 25 to 64. These are going to be your workhorses, right? This is where most, this is where the blue is. Thankfully, it's blue here. It's blue in the other graph as well. These are your workhorses. These people are producing pretty much everything. And what they produce has to cover these guys, has to cover these guys, has to cover these guys, has to cover these guys. And it also has to cover disabled people and caregivers and unemployed people who are in the blue, right? And then we got, younger folks, and obviously some of these people work, but, they're some of them are in school, unemployment is often high in this age range. But this is like the core workers. So what you can see over time, and actually you can animate it here. You can see as the year moves on, 1978, the red grows. The red is growing, the red is growing, the blue is shrinking. And when that happens, especially when the blue shrinks, you run into the problem I was saying before. You have less workers producing for more people, right? And so you can kind of see how this plays out, which is interesting. So let's start here in 1950 with Sweden, and let's look at the blue. Let's focus specifically on the blue. So in 1950 Sweden, 54% of the population is in this prime bucket, this 25 to 64 years. These, again, are the workhorses of the population. And what's interesting is at first, we don't see it because it starts a little bit earlier there, but it's just declining, right? It starts out at 54% roughly, and it's just declining. And the elderly are taking up a bigger and bigger share. Children are also shrinking, though, in this period, right? Because they're having fewer kids. Here come the elderly, bigger and bigger share. And here's an interesting part, right? So here it actually kicks up. And so one of the things that happens is a population will reduce the number of children it's having, right? So instead of having 2.5 kids per woman, they start having 1.5 kids per woman or something like that. And at first, this actually makes your society richer, right? Because you have the same number of workers, but you have fewer kids. So you have more workhorses making income, and you have less dependents to take care of. So initially, when you drop the fertility rate, you kind of get a little bit of a boom from it, right? Because you have fewer mouths to feed. And you kind of see this happen here a little bit, right? So it starts to kick up, right? So here we got ages 25 to 64 are 50%, and now it goes up to 51, 52, 53. And what's happening here primarily is that the kids are just shrinking. They're just having fewer kids. The fertility went down quite a bit. And when you have fewer kids, like I said, there's less people in the denominator, dragging down the population because kids, they need food, but they don't produce it. They need to consume, but they don't work, right? So it starts to grow, but then eventually you get to the other side of it. And today's kids become tomorrow's workers. And if you didn't have them, then the blue's going to shrink. And now you're in a situation in Sweden where 1 in 5 people is over the age of 65, and you've got a workforce that's only half the population, and that's going to be a little tough. Finland, same story here. So let's run the animation here. We start in 1950. As you can see, Finland's quite a bit more dramatic. I'd say Finland is in sort of the worst position of the 4 when it comes to the aging population issue. And we got the same thing here, right? So we start out with a lot of kids. So we start out where the middle, the workhorses, the 25 to 64, they're only 47% of the population, but not because there's a lot of elderly, but because there's a lot of kids. And kids, of course, are the future, so they become the workers of the future. And so that's going all well and good. But then you can see right here, about 1970, the number of kids starts to drop. Actually, the under 5s drop immediately, right? So we go from 12.5% under 5s to 10 to 9 to 7, right? And then it just trickles up. If you have fewer under 5s, then you end up having fewer 5 to 14-year-olds 5 years later. And then you end up having fewer 15 to 24-year-olds 10 years later. And then you end up, it all eventually filters out at the end. So at first, you kind of get a little boom from this, right? So watch, the 25 to 64 goes up 50%, 51%, 52%, 53%. Oh my God, we're rolling in it. Look what percentage of our population are the workhorses. We're producing so much stuff and we have to spread it across not that many people. So great, it's going up 54, 50. But then wait a minute. Since we didn't have very many kids, now we don't have very many workers. And now here come the elderly as a share of a population. And we just fall off a cliff here, 52, 51, 50, 50, all the way down to 50. Now, as you can see, they're not any worse off than they were at the beginning. In fact, they're still better off because it was 47% of the population that were in this workhorse years, down now only up to 50%, right? But it's in the decline. And over time, this is sort of going to get worse and worse. And if the population is not replacing itself, you run into this kind of situation, which is challenging. But for the time being, it's all good. And as we saw with the other graphs, their finances are great. We have the same graph here for the U.S. The U.S. has not had as much of a fertility drop until lately. So you can see the U.S. is, doing comparatively better in that, you look at, remember, like Sweden had 20% of their population were elderly. We're only at 17% for us. For Finland, 22% of the population is elderly. We're only 16%. But you can see we have a similar kind of dynamic here that's unfolding, right? So look, the kids start to grow with the baby boom a little bit. We see the baby boom reflected here. We don't get the start of it, but we see the baby boom reflected here as the kids grow. In the population, the workhorses start out at 50% of the population. Baby boom brings their numbers down to 47%, 45%, 44%, 44%. But then, around the 70s, fertility starts to drop. And, we're improving. We're improving. Oh, wow. We have more workers, 49%, 50%, 51%. Great. You know, we didn't have so many kids. So since we didn't have so many kids, the workhorses are growing. What a great boom time we're having. But eventually, if you don't have kids, you face the other problem on the other side. And we have not faced it quite yet, but as you can see, it's starting to come. So they're really more just like a few years down the line. But this has nothing to do with the welfare state. It has to do with fertility and the age structure of the population. And if the age structure of the population starts tilting this way, you're going to have problems to the extent that you have them. You're going to have problems regardless of the welfare state, right? Because at the end of the day, what's the alternative to the welfare state? How are you going to take care of the elderly without the welfare state? Oh, well, they'll just have like savings and personal retirement accounts and whatever. Oh, okay, so the old will just sock away a lot of money and then they'll live on that money in retirement, except what do they buy with the money? They got to go into the market and buy stuff. But if you don't have very many people working, then there's nothing for them to buy. You can't eat money, right? So the plight of the elderly, the ability to care for the elderly and the ability to care for dependents more generally is going to depend not on how you finance it, whether you use personal retirement accounts, the welfare state, or whatever. It's going to depend fundamentally on this ratio, on this percentage. What is the percentage for 25 to 64-year-olds? It's going to depend on that. If that ratio starts slipping and slipping, then, you know, your resources are going to get a bit strained. Regardless, again, of whether you organize this, taking care of dependents with the welfare state, or you organize it through family transfers, or you organize it through the financial system with savings and spend downs and all that. It doesn't really matter. Those are all just different mechanisms for achieving the same thing. Some are better than the other. I think clearly the welfare state is the best approach, but they would all struggle with an aging population, and they could cause all of these things to sort of, none of these things to go broke, but it could cause stress related to people not, especially workers saying, I don't know if I want to give up even more of my money, to the elderly or whatever. So yeah, that's pretty much it. The welfare state doesn't cause you to go broke. The financial position of the government, you can manage that easily. And these countries, I mean, what's there to, what are we arguing about here? They're clearly doing better than we are financially in terms of government. So anyways, please ask me questions like that. I love to answer these questions. Yeah, give me some more.